The gravel of the restricted service road grated beneath the tires of the ancient rust-flecked pickup. The sound, a ragged whisper of finality against the vast, indifferent quiet of the Cascade Mountain range. Patricia Johnson held herself rigid against the passenger door, the thin nylon of her thrift store jacket doing little to stop the chill seeping into her core, a physical manifestation of the bone-deep abandonment that had become her constant companion. She was 34 years old, but the events of the last 9 months, the sudden, brutal death of her husband in a suspiciously quick accident, the sham legal battles that followed, and the wholesale theft of their small, thriving timber ranch, had aged her soul into something brittle and grey. Her brother-in-law, Ronald Harris, a man whose face was a study in self-satisfied avarice, drove with a white-knuckled grip, his sour, stale breath misting the already dusty windshield. His voice, when it came, was a guttural sneer aimed more at the towering silent forest than at her. He had called her worthless, a liability, a curse on his family name. But the reality was simpler and colder. She was the last obstacle to the deed for the valuable lower timber rights, the last loose end in his meticulous scheme of theft. The physical symbol of her dispossession was a jagged, barely healed laceration that ran from her elbow almost to her wrist, a vicious memento from the accident Ronald had orchestrated, a shove during a manufactured argument that ended with her arm slamming through a broken pane of glass. The injury was severe enough to require dozens of sutures and, crucially, to allow the local magistrate, easily swayed by Ronald's deep pockets and the solemn false testimony of Sheriff James Smith, to rule her temporarily incompetent and a ward of the estate. Her debt, according to the county's paperwork, which Ronald had cheerfully forged, was a staggering 27 months of court-mandated service to discharge the supposed cost of litigation and damages. And this, the cruel dumping of her on the edge of the wilderness, was his chosen place of payment. They ascended the winding, treacherous road for what felt like an hour, until the temperature dropped precipitously and the air thinned, smelling distinctly of pine, ozone, and wet granite. The truck sputtered, coughed, and finally jolted to a stop in a small, isolated clearing. This space was dominated not by a rustic stone cabin, but by a towering skeletal structure of steel and concrete, a fire lookout post, a stark sentinel against the endless, hostile skyline. It was functional, industrial, a structure built for necessity and vigilance, not for comfort or habitation. Smoke did not curl lazily from a chimney. Rather, the metallic glint of a radio antenna pointed defiantly at the turbulent, high-altitude blue. Ronald killed the engine, the sudden silence immediately oppressive. He grabbed a dirty canvas duffel bag, her entire worldly possession, and thrust it onto the ground. "Here's your new post, Patricia. The county's given you to the state, for unpaid services. Said you're a menace to civil society, but may be useful for scut work." He pointed an accusing finger at the lookout tower, the gesture radiating malicious triumph. "That man up there, he's David Miller, a former smoke jumper, now just a burned-out caretaker. He owes the Forest Service more than he can pay, so they let him live up here in isolation. He's supposed to be alone. You disrupt his operation, and I'll have the sheriff up here with a full warrant. You won't see daylight again, understand?" He didn't wait for a response. He threw the truck into a harsh reverse, the tires spitting gravel, and was gone, the sound swallowed by the deep woods, leaving behind a silence heavier than any storm. Patricia stood alone in the clearing, the wind whipping past, pulling involuntary tears from her eyes that were instantly chilled. She looked up. The structure was formidable, a concrete base supporting 4 heavy steel legs, culminating in a compact, glass-walled cab almost 80 feet above the ground. It was a dizzying height, a physical barrier to the world below. After a moment, a heavy metallic door at the base, built to withstand tremendous pressure, ground open with a low, deliberate sound that spoke of strong mechanisms and absolute isolation. The man who emerged was not built like a mountain man of legend, but like the resilient ancient trees surrounding them. David Miller was tall, lean, and intensely focused, dressed in dark green workwear and heavy-duty boots that looked less like a uniform and more like a second functional skin. His face, etched with the fine lines that constant exposure to sun, smoke, and extreme elevation leaves, was shadowed by a wide-brimmed felt hat. His eyes were the color of glacial ice, clear, unblinking, and utterly devoid of anything resembling welcome or fear. He carried a heavy-duty military-grade first aid pack and a stainless steel thermos. He descended the 43 steps of the steel staircase with the controlled, economical movement of a professional who never wastes energy or breath. He didn't acknowledge Ronald Harris's departed truck or the abandoned duffel bag. His gaze landed on Patricia, then swept down to her lacerated arm, which she had been trying instinctively to conceal beneath the cuff of her jacket. "Ronald said you were delivered." David's voice was low, rough, like dry timber being dragged over rock. It was a statement of fact, devoid of inflection. "Said you had 27 months of community duty to fulfill." Patricia finally found her voice, a dry, choked sound. "He lied. He stole everything. The court, the sheriff, they were paid off. The cut, it was him." David raised a gloved hand, cutting her off not unkindly, but with pure professional detachment. "Doesn't matter what he said. You're on federal land now. I deal with what is. Sit." He pointed to a low, flat-topped boulder near the base of the tower. He did not ask her history or her pain. He saw a wound, and he assessed it as a logistical problem. He knelt before her, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he opened the kit. He cleaned the angry, swollen wound with an antiseptic wipe, the sting a clean, sharp pain that was strangely grounding after months of emotional turmoil. She flinched, not from the physical sensation, but from the simple, unearned attention. It was the first act of true, non-judgmental care she had received in nearly a year. He was applying a thick, medical-grade adhesive strip, sealing the wound against the mountain environment, when he finally spoke again, his focus still absolute on the task. "This is not a home. This is a post. The rules are few. I don't talk much. You don't interfere with the radio or the mapping table. You cook, you clean the generator shed. You keep the perimeter clear of brush. You owe the state time, and I need a second pair of hands for inventory and observation." He finished the dressing, giving her a quick, impersonal nod. Up in the tower now, it's dropping below freezing rapidly. He led her up the narrow, vertigo-inducing stairs. The cab at the top was not a place of refuge, but of intense life-and-death function. It was a single, compact room, dominated by the Osborne Firefighter map, a massive circular desk with a sighting mechanism at its center, surrounded by banks of radios, weather instruments, and topographical charts. The air inside was warm, dry, and carried the smell of electronics, fresh paper, and diesel fuel. He pointed to a compact military-grade sleeping bag rolled neatly on a small cot in one corner and a pot of chili simmering on a propane stove. "Eat, sleep. At 0500 hours, we check the horizon." He took his place at the firefinder, his broad back to her, and began to log coordinates into a thick, leather-bound journal. The only sounds were the crackle of the radio and the low, constant hum of the tower's generator. He had shut out the world, but in the process, he had inadvertently shut her in, creating a shared isolation that was both frightening and profoundly secure. Patricia ate the chili. The warmth spread through her, loosening the rigid, painful knot of fear in her stomach. She watched David's reflection in the glass, his profile sharp and steady. Everything about him was pared down to the essence of survival and necessity. There was no sentimentality, no wasted motion. He was a creature of function, a solitary guardian against the immense destructive power of the wild. Days folded into a routine as precise and unforgiving as the mountain weather. David would leave before dawn to check the remote satellite relays or maintain the emergency landing zone 4,000 feet below. He'd return at dusk, smelling of pine needles and cold air, his gaze fixed on the horizon, never her. Patricia, in turn, learned to exist within his space without consuming it. She cleaned the precision instruments with meticulous care, organized the endless stacks of topographical maps, and made the meals with quiet competence. She found a strange, compelling peace in the lack of conversation. Her words had always been twisted and used as weapons in the valley below, but here on this silent granite peak, they were not needed. Her voice, long trapped by fear and shame, was finally resting. He was a man who communicated through action. A freshly sharpened pencil on the map meant he needed new coordinates logged. A full tank of propane for the stove was a quiet acknowledgement of the meal she'd left simmering. She began to observe the small, almost microscopic details of his existence. She saw the slight involuntary tremor in his left hand when the wind picked up, the way he always checked the tension on the emergency radio antennae, and the brief, almost instantaneous way His eyes flicked towards a small framed photo tucked behind a stack of manuals, a picture of a young woman in a fire jacket, smiling fiercely. This silent life, devoid of judgment and greed, began to stir something long dormant in Patricia. Her terror of the outside world, of being pursued by Ronald, was slowly being replaced by a fierce, quiet pride in her utility. She wasn't just surviving in his space, she was maintaining their vigilance. The fire lookout was not a prison, it was a post she was now defending with her attention and her work. The summer passed with the intense, focused energy of a sustained alert. They lived through a series of small, contained crises, a microburst storm that tested the integrity of the tower's anchors, a brief, terrifying lightning strike that knocked out the primary communication array, and the constant, draining patrol for the smoke that symbolized destruction. Through all of it, their communication remained a precise dance of necessity. Patricia knew without being told that a change in the compass reading on the Firefighter meant a wind shift requiring her to update the complex fire behavior model on the desktop computer. David knew that the slight increase in the density of her coffee meant she was aware he was heading out on a prolonged 15-mile traverse to check the remote sensors. Their quiet was not emptiness. It was a profound, mutual respect for the high-stakes environment they shared. The emotional deepening, however, began not with words, but with an act of shared vulnerability. One evening, a sudden, fierce squall descended from the north, not a blizzard, but a catastrophic derecho, the wind howling like 1,000 banshees trying to tear the tower from its foundation. The thick glass walls rattled violently, and the whole structure began to sway with a groan of stressed steel. Patricia was on the floor holding tight to the leg of the plotting table, her eyes wide with a terror that surpassed the danger of the storm itself. She wasn't afraid of the wind. She was reliving the night Ronald Harris had finally cornered her, the night of her accident, when the sound of shattering glass and roaring engines had overwhelmed her senses. She was immobilized by flashback. David, usually a rock of unflappable calm, looked up from securing the comms unit. His eyes, usually distant and focused on the horizon, locked onto her. He saw the way she was curled, not against the cold, but against an internal scream, an emotional exposure he instinctively recognized as a threat to survival. Without a word, he crossed the 5 feet separating them. He didn't offer comfort. He rose, went to his supply chest, and pulled out his primary field jacket, the heavy-duty Nomex and Kevlar shell he always wore when rappelling from the helicopter. He returned and draped the massive coat over her shoulders. It was heavy, smelling strongly of ozone, smoke, and the clean, cold mountain air that defined him. "You're unsecured," he said, his voice quiet, rough from disuse, yet carrying the steady, non-negotiable weight of a commander's order. It was not a question or an invitation, but an identification of a fault in her defense. In the ringing, chaotic noise of the storm, his simple declaration was an admission that he saw beyond the worker, beyond the debt, to the person who was emotionally exposed. It was a terrifying, yet anchoring acknowledgement. He saw her vulnerability, and he secured it. The next day, as the storm retreated and left behind an unnatural, crystalline stillness, the shift in their dynamic was palpable. He started to leave small, non-essential things on her cot. Not trinkets of affection, but tokens of shared interest and reconnaissance. A perfectly preserved hawk feather he'd found on the service road, a piece of fossilized jet-black wood polished smooth by river runoff, a freshly printed topographical map of the adjacent forest showing a forgotten trail she'd been curious about. Each object was a silent affirmation of her presence and her intellectual capacity. One rainy afternoon, as Patricia was inventorying his survival cache, she found a series of deep gouges on the wooden frame of a large, custom-built radio console. She ran her fingers over them, 3 deep scores, then a pause, then 2 more. She realized they were old, deliberate, and not accidental damage. That night, she hummed a low, comforting hymn from her childhood while cleaning the propane lamps. She saw David pause at the top of the stairs, his hand frozen on the latch, listening to the small, fragile sound that had just filled his sterile world. He didn't speak, but he held the silence for a full minute before slipping out into the dusk. The emotional connection deepened through their shared ghosts. Patricia would wake, choking on silent screams of the court hearings, the magistrate's sneer, and the searing psychological pain of the wound that still ached. David would often be standing silently by the map table, a sentinel watching over her until the trembling subsided. He never moved, never offered an embrace, but his still presence was the anchor she needed. One particularly dark night, the sound of the wind, combined with the crackle of the long-range radio, seemed to overwhelm him. He cried out, a sound choked with a grief so immediate and profound it seemed to pull the oxygen from the room. "Mark!" The name hung in the dense air, raw and devastating. Patricia lay still, her heart aching with a sorrow that was not hers, yet completely familiar. The next morning, she finally looked at the small, framed photo he kept hidden. It was an old fire crew photo. 2 men in identical gear. The man next to David, younger, broad-shouldered, with a fierce grin, was almost certainly Mark Anderson. David, running a thumb over the blurred glass, caught her eye. He didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled the photo out, his hands unsteady, and placed it on the plotting table. "My partner," he finally whispered, the 2 words sounding like granite grinding together. "Smoke jumper. Went into a remote inferno 3 years ago. I pulled the trigger on the retardant drop too late. Or too soon, doesn't matter. He was gone. It was my call." His confession was the key that unlocked the sterile functionalism of the tower. They were not 2 people simply existing in a space. They were 2 people haunted by different fires, sharing a solitary post, the only safe place left for either of them. Patricia, in turn, began to reclaim her own strength by making herself indispensable. She wasn't just doing chores. She was making the post a command center. She found his disorganized inventory of emergency equipment, an overwhelming task he had neglected since Mark's death. She catalogued every length of climbing rope, every dehydrated meal, every flare gun, creating a precise, indexed spreadsheet that replaced the chaos. She was not just a survivor, she was a partner in his mission, a co-defender of the post. But the world they had shut out had a long memory. A week later, David found the tracks. They weren't the deep, clean imprints of hikers or forest service patrols. They were distinct, deep mud tread marks from an older, heavily loaded all-terrain vehicle, a model known to be favored by local hunters skirting restricted areas. 2 sets of prints circling the perimeter, too close, too hesitant, human, and looking for them. David's granite face hardened further. The quiet in the lookout changed instantly from sanctuary to coiled tension. He spent the day meticulously checking every security measure, recalibrating the solar panel arrays, reinforcing the door mechanisms, and most crucially, setting up a backup, encrypted communication line on the secondary radio unit, a rarely used VHF channel. He retrieved a heavy-duty Halligan tool, an instrument of forcible entry and rescue, from a locked floor panel beneath his cot. He sharpened the axe end of the tool until it gleamed with a hungry, dangerous light. That evening, he pressed a satellite phone into her hands, an expensive, emergency-only piece of gear. His eyes held hers, conveying an urgent, non-negotiable message. "If the power fails, if the main radio goes silent, you call this number. The number is State Search and Rescue. You tell them you are 80 feet up and you saw confirmed Class A fire on the western ridge. Do not tell them anything else. Do not come down, no matter what you hear." The fire they were now preparing for was not in the trees. It was aimed at their fragile, shared peace. The next morning, a voice crackled through the main radio unit, unexpected and laced with false authority. "Lookout Station 1 to 7, this is Sheriff James Smith. I have a court-ordered warrant here for the retrieval of a fugitive, Patricia Johnson, who has been illegally occupying federal land and is in violation of her parole conditions. You are ordered to descend immediately and surrender the subject." Sheriff Smith's voice, amplified by the static, was cold and absolute, the sound of the old world reclaiming its debt. The legal system, bought and paid for by Ronald Harris, was coming to finish the job. David did not touch the transmit button. He looked at Patricia, his face a mask of set granite. He was not surprised. He knew Ronald and the sheriff worked in concert, using the thin veil of law to mask outright greed. They were coming for the woman, but they were also coming for the strategic location of the lookout, valuable federal land that Ronald wanted to add to his expanding timber domain. "They're coming for the land," Patricia said, her voice clear and startlingly strong. She gripped the satellite phone, her knuckles white. "They need me gone so the warrant holds up and the incompetency ruling stands. They'll use the main service road, it's the fastest. But there is a secondary path, An old hydro line easement to the west. It's unstable, full of rock debris, but they will take it to approach without being seen from the town below. David looked at her, and in his winter-clear eyes, a flicker of something new ignited. Respect. She was not a charge to be protected. She was a tactician, a fellow soldier who knew the terrain and the enemy's desperate mindset. He nodded once, acknowledging her strategy. He moved with immediate, terrifying purpose. He secured the Halligan bar into his duty belt. He began to broadcast a series of pre-written weather and air traffic advisories over the main channel, a deceptive signal that would keep the sheriff convinced they were still operational and complacent. Then, on the secondary encrypted VHF channel, he began to tap out a rapid, complex message to a handful of pre-programmed contacts, former smoke-jumping colleagues, the regional fire command, and the head of the local volunteer search and rescue team. Code Sierra 3, unauthorized approach, lookout 17. Need ground and air support, rapid deployment. Breach imminent. Bring evidence. They came at late afternoon, just as the setting sun was painting the western peaks in hues of gold and menacing violet. Ronald Harris, his face bloated with self-righteous fury, and Sheriff Smith, clutching a heavy evidence folder like a holy weapon, parked their ATV not on the main road, but exactly where Patricia had predicted, on the precarious hydro line easement. Two other heavies, local thugs hired by Ronald, fanned out, moving with a clumsy, forced stealth, convinced they were executing a flawless sneak attack. "Come out, felon!" Ronald shrieked, his voice distorted by the cold air. "Surrender the property! You have defiled this federal asset!" The lookout remained silent. Ronald gestured, and one of the thugs began to cut the perimeter fence around the base. They didn't see the tiny, almost invisible thermal tripwire David had laid across the path near a notorious debris field. A moment later, a loud, grinding crunch echoed through the clearing. The thug had stepped exactly where the ground was unstable, triggering a small controlled rock slide that sent a cascade of granite and soil down the slope, pinning his leg beneath a 200-pound boulder. The man screamed, the sound sharp and thin against the vast silence. From the base of the tower, David emerged. He was not the quiet, focused sentinel of the lookout. He was something primal, an embodiment of the wilderness's unforgiving laws. He moved with a terrifying, fluid grace, the Halligan tool an extension of his arm, used to disable and intimidate, not to kill. It was not a battle of men, it was a collision between the disciplined, wild-trained resilience of the mountain and the soft, corrupt civilization that had come to conquer it. David moved towards the sheriff and Ronald, forcing them to retreat further up the slope, away from the access road. Ronald, enraged, drew a standard-issue pistol from his belt, a clear violation of the arrest protocol. He fired. The shot cracked through the twilight and David grunted, stumbling back against the steel leg of the tower, a dark stain spreading on the fleshy part of his left shoulder. "The land is mine, you forest animal, and so is the debt." Ronald advanced, the pistol aimed at David's head. Just as the silence stretched taut with the threat of death, the low, powerful thump, thump, thump of a helicopter cut through the air. A massive Sikorsky, painted in the orange and white livery of the State Search and Rescue, crested the ridge, its spotlight snapping on, bathing the scene in a blinding, artificial noon. The roar of the rotors was their wolves, their family, arriving with coordinated deadliness. And then, Patricia stepped out of the tower's base and into the intense spotlight. She was holding a slim, leather-bound volume, the original handwritten ledger detailing her husband's land claims and the predatory loans Ronald had used to seize their assets. She walked toward Ronald, her gaze unwavering, her voice clear and ringing in the noise. "You wanted a debt paid? Here is the truth." She threw the ledger onto the gravel, opening it to a page detailing the 42 fraudulent transfers. "You and Sheriff Smith branded me a fugitive, a liar, to steal this land. The sin was yours, Ronald, not mine." The truth, spoken aloud and illuminated by the rescue light, shattered Sheriff Smith's false authority and wiped the sneer from Ronald's face, replacing it with raw, naked fear. The helicopter, hovering directly overhead, began to drop two figures in full gear, an EMT and a state trooper. David pushed himself off the tower leg, blood weeping into the snow. He looked at the two intruders, but his words were for Patricia, for the ghosts that had kept him prisoner. "I let the fire take mark," he said, his voice a raw tear in the fabric of the night. "I carried that guilt alone for 3 years." He spoke the truth of his fire, and in doing so, he set his ghost free. The state trooper moved in quickly, securing Ronald and the sheriff. The EMT rushed to David. The network of people who respected David's lonely work had judged the intruders and found them guilty of trespass and fraud. An hour later, as the injured man was stabilized, Patricia sat beside him in the warmth of the tower, cleaning his wound with the same steady, sure touch he had used on her that first day. The roles were reversed. The circle was complete. The next day David was quiet, but it was a new kind of quiet, a lighter one. He sat for hours carving a small piece of wood from a section of salvaged cedar. Finally, he looked at her. They will not come back. The sheriff is suspended. The land is being recovered. You do not have to stay. You're free. Patricia looked around the small, functional cab, at the plotting table, at the heavy Halligan tool, at the man who had seen her, fought for her, and found his own redemption in her defense. "This was not a prison," she whispered. "This is the only place I'm safe. I have nowhere else to be." He shook his head slowly, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips for the first time. "You have here." The unspoken words hung between them. "If you'll have it." She nodded. A week later, as they watched the sunrise paint the valley, David came and stood behind her. He took the thin, fraying cord of her hair and with his rough, scarred fingers began to braid it. It was a simple, repetitive motion of an oath taken. When he was finished, he threaded the piece of wood he had been carving, a single miniature cedar charm of the lookout tower itself, polished smooth and perfect, onto the cord. He leaned close, his breath warm against her ear. "Welcome home. Let's watch the horizon together." A year passed. On a small functional metal shelf inside the tower, a new photo had been placed, a snapshot of Patricia, not smiling fiercely like the old one, but with a quiet, certain contentment, standing next to David. They sat in their dedicated chairs, one watching the weather gauge, the other monitoring the infrared feed. He had not given her sons in the way the world understood, but he had given her a mission, a partnership, and a quiet love that had grown as strong and resilient as the mountain itself. If you were moved by this story of courage, resilience, and finding family where you least expect it, we invite you to register and join our community. We are so glad to have you. Tell us in the comments below which city or remote mountain post you are watching this story from. Did you like the video, and what lesson about finding sanctuary and vulnerability did you learn from Patricia and David? We love hearing your reflections on the strength found in unexpected beginnings.